stepmother's voice carried across the entire ballroom before I had even taken off my coat. "Does she have to stand right here?" she said to my father, loud enough for the nearest 20 guests to hear. "She looks like she drove here from a construction site." My father laughed, not the uncomfortable kind, the easy, genuinely amused kind. I was wearing a clean blazer and flats. I had ironed the blazer that morning in a motel bathroom because my apartment lease had ended 2 weeks before and I hadn't found a new place yet. I was 31 years old, living out of a suitcase, attending my half-brother's engagement party at the Whitmore Club in downtown Chicago, and my father thought what his wife said was funny. My half-brother Colt was standing near the bar. He caught my eye, looked away first. I stayed exactly where I was. There were maybe 150 people in the room. The Whitmore Club was the kind of place that charged a membership fee most people would call a car payment. Brass fixtures, dark wood paneling, servers in white jackets circulating with champagne flutes. My stepmother had planned the party for months. Everything was precisely what she wanted it to be. Everything except me. I found a corner near the windows and stayed there. Outside, Lake Michigan was grey and flat under a November sky. Inside, people talked about Colt's new position at a downtown firm and his fiancée Lindsay's family connections, and how beautiful the venue was. No one brought me a drink. No one came to stand with me. I had not expected them to. The woman who finally approached me was someone I didn't recognize. 50-ish, silver earrings, the particular posture of a person who has spent decades being the most competent person in any room she entered. "You're Yvonne?" she said. "Not a question. I said I was." "Nina Calloway," she said. "I sit on the board of the Meridian Foundation. We've been trying to get your attention for 6 months." Before I could answer, Colt appeared at her elbow. "Nina," he said, his smile wide and practiced, "I'm so glad you made it. Have you met my father? He'd love to connect with you about the hospital wing project." He guided her away without acknowledging me at all. I watched them go. Nina Calloway glanced back once, something specific in her expression, like she had just confirmed something she already suspected. "I didn't stay for dinner. My mother died when I was 9. That's not the beginning of the story, but it's where the shape of everything else comes from. She was a ceramics teacher at a community college in Evanston. She drove a 10-year-old Civic and made soup from scratch on Sundays, and used to take me to the Art Institute on weekday afternoons when it wasn't crowded. She died from an infection that moved fast and didn't give anyone time to prepare. My father remarried 14 months later. I don't say that to make him a villain. Grief does what it does to people. But 14 months is 14 months, and his new wife Sandra had 2 opinions she held simultaneously, without apparent contradiction, that she was wonderful for taking on a stepchild, and that the stepchild was fundamentally the wrong kind of child for household. Too quiet, too interested in the wrong things. Not as easy or as bright as Colt, who was her son and who seemed to arrive fully formed as everything my father wanted in a child. I learned early that making myself smaller did not make me easier to love. It just made me easier to overlook. I left for college at 18 on a partial scholarship and a federal loan package and a weekend job at a copy shop that smelled permanently of toner. My father helped Colt with his tuition. When I mentioned once that I was struggling with a bill, he said I should be building character through self-reliance. He said this without a trace of irony. I graduated with a degree in urban planning, moved into a shared apartment in Wicker Park with 3 roommates, and started at a small non-profit that worked on affordable housing policy. The salary was not quite enough, but it was a salary and the work was real. And for the first time in my life, no one in my immediate vicinity was actively disappointed in me. I was good at the work. I was better than good. I had grown up watching what happened to people when the systems around them failed. I had seen what it meant for a single parent to lose an affordable apartment, what it did to a family to be priced out of a school district, and I brought that knowledge into every policy analysis I wrote. I understood the numbers, but I also understood what the numbers meant to actual people, and that combination turned out to be rarer than I expected. My supervisor at the time, a woman named Dr. Phyllis O'Caffer told me once that I had a talent for translating complexity into language that made politicians feel intelligent rather than corrected. She said it like it was a compliment. I understood that it was also a warning. I stayed at the non-profit for 3 years. I was effective and underpaid, and I had begun to understand that these two facts were related. The people who ran organizations like mine were genuine and committed and often completely unprepared to advocate for their own staff. I didn't blame them. I started looking. The move that changed everything felt small at the time. A contact from a policy conference mentioned that a boutique urban development consultancy was looking for a senior analyst. The firm was called Arden Group. 6 people, 1 floor of an office building in River North, a client list that included 3 major Midwest cities and 2 hospital systems and a university endowment. I interviewed twice and was offered the position at a salary that made me sit in my car for 10 minutes before I drove home. I took it. I was 31 years old, living out of a suitcase, and I was the new senior analyst at a firm that quietly shaped how hundreds of millions of dollars in development capital moved through Midwestern cities. No one in my family knew this. I had not told them because they had never asked, and because I had learned years ago that giving my father information about my life only provided new material for his disappointment. The engagement party was 2 weeks into my new job. I went because Colt had actually sent an invitation, which was unusual enough that I thought it might mean something. It didn't. He wanted numbers in the room. I was a number. The woman, Mina Calloway. The Meridian Foundation. I looked her up that night in my motel room. The Meridian Foundation managed a $400 million endowment dedicated to urban development and affordable housing across the Great Lakes region. Nina Calloway had been its executive director for 11 years. She had a reputation for being direct, rigorous, and impossible to charm with anything other than actual substance. She had been trying to reach me for 6 months. I found the emails the next morning. They had been going to an old address I'd stopped checking after I left the non-profit. 6 emails, each one more specific than the last, each one describing a multi-year initiative that needed exactly the kind of analytical framework I had spent the past 4 years developing. The final email, sent 3 weeks earlier, said simply, "I've heard you may be at the Callahan engagement party. I'll be there. I'd like 5 minutes." I wrote back and asked if she still had 5 minutes. She replied in 4 hours. She wanted a meeting, not 5 minutes. The meeting with Nina Calloway lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes and changed the shape of the next 4 years of my life. She was building something she called a regional equity initiative, a structured framework for channeling private and philanthropic capital into housing development in communities that had been systematically underinvested. It was complicated, ambitious, and long overdue. She had the funding. She had the relationships. What she didn't have was someone who could build the analytical infrastructure that would make the whole system legible to the municipalities, developers, and donors who needed to trust it enough to participate. She wanted me. I was still technically in my first month at Arden Group. I told her this. I also told her I was interested and asked if we could find a structure that didn't require me to leave. She paused. "You think Arden would let you consult?" "I think they'd be interested in the relationship," I said. She looked at me with that specific expression I had seen from her at the engagement party, the one that confirmed something. "All right," she said. "Propose it to them and come back to me." I proposed it. Arden agreed faster than I expected. They understood immediately what access to Meridian's network meant for their business development. For the next 2 years, I worked in a state of controlled chaos. My days at Arden were dense with client work. My evenings and weekends went to Meridian. I built a data framework that tracked investment flows, displacement risk, and community outcome indicators across 14 counties. I wrote the methodology that 3 separate city planning departments eventually adopted. I gave presentations to municipal councils and foundation boards and developer consortiums, and I learned to read a room the way Dr. Okafor had once described, translating complexity into language that made the people across the table feel capable rather than lectured. I also made mistakes. A projection model I built for a Milwaukee initiative overstated the displacement risk in one census tract due to a data integration error I caught only after the report had gone out. I owned it immediately, issued a corrected version with a full explanation, and spent a Saturday on a call with the Milwaukee city planner walking through exactly what had changed and why. She thanked me. Nina told me later that the way I handled it had done more for my reputation with that office than the original report. I learned something from that, though it took me time to articulate it. The error wasn't the problem. How I responded to the error was what people actually saw. At Arden, I was learning a different set of lessons. The firm's founder was a man named Edward Marsh, 62, former city planner turned consultant, deeply knowledgeable and constitutionally incapable of delegating in ways that weren't passive-aggressive. He valued my work and resented my competence in roughly equal measure. When I identified an inefficiency in our client reporting that was costing us credibility with the hospital system account, he thanked me in the meeting and then spent 6 weeks finding reasons to exclude me from the follow-up work. I recognized the pattern. I'd grown up inside a version of it. I didn't push back. I documented everything, did the work that was given to me with full effort, and paid close attention to what Edward was actually afraid of. What he was afraid of, I eventually understood, was becoming unnecessary. His entire professional identity was built on being the person who held the relationships. If I built my own relationships with clients, which was happening naturally, because I was the one who actually answered their questions, he would become the figurehead of his own firm. I was not trying to take anything from him, but I understood that his fear was real and that there was no version of my doing my job well that would ever make him comfortable. The question was how long I was willing to work inside that constraint. Nina answered the question for me. She came to me 18 months into the Meridian project with a proposal I hadn't seen coming. The Meridian Foundation was restructuring. The Regional Equity Initiative was being spun off into its own operating entity, a hybrid non-profit advisory structure that would continue to manage the analytical and strategic work while taking on a broader mandate. She wanted me to lead it, not as a consultant, as director. The salary was real. The equity in the advisory arm was real. The mandate was everything I had been working toward since I was 24 years old, sitting in a non-profit office, understanding that the systems were broken in ways I could eventually help fix. I gave Arden Group 3 months' notice. Edward Marsh did not take it well. He told me I was making a naive decision and that I would discover very quickly that leading an organization was different from analyzing one. He said this with the specific confidence of a person who has never had to reckon with being wrong. I said I appreciated his perspective and that I hoped we could maintain the professional relationship. We have not spoken since. The structure I built over the next 3 years was called Meridian Arden Partners. The name was Nina's idea, a nod to both lineages that had shaped the work. We were a 10-person team, a $40 million operating budget in our second year, and a growing reputation for being the organization that other organizations called when they needed to understand what was actually happening on the ground. I was 34 when Forbes Midwest ran a profile on us. The photograph they used was of me standing in front of a housing development in Gary, Indiana, wearing a hard hat and a winter coat and looking at the camera with what the caption called "Quiet Authority." My father apparently saw it. I know this because Colt called me. "Dad wants to know if the article is accurate," he said. "Hello to you too," I said. "Which parts?" "The part about the endowment you manage. It's accurate." A pause. "He wants to connect." "I'm sure he does," I said. "Tell him to have his assistant reach out to mine." I hung up before Colt could respond. The call from my father's assistant came the next day. He was hosting his annual holiday dinner at the Whitmore Club, the same venue as Colt's engagement party, 3 years earlier. He was extending a formal invitation and wanted me to know that he was proud of what I had accomplished. Proud, in the context of a formal invitation delivered through an assistant after a Forbes profile. I thought about not going. I thought about it seriously, but there was something that felt unresolved. Not about them, but about myself. Something I had been carrying since I was 9 years old and learning what it meant to be the child no one quite knew how to love. I had built something real. I had done it without them. and sometimes in spite of them. And I realized that I did not need to go for them. I could go for the version of me who had once sat in that corner by the lake window, wondering if she would ever stop feeling like a guest in her own life. I accepted. The Whitmore Club looked exactly the same. The brass fixtures, the dark wood, the servers in white jackets. My father was near the entrance when I arrived. He had aged, not badly, but visibly. He smiled when he saw me, and the smile had something complicated in it that I hadn't seen before. An effort, a calculation. "Yvonne," he said, "you look wonderful." "Thank you," I said. "You look well." He glanced at the woman beside me, my colleague and closest friend, a woman named Dr. Priya Venkatesh, who had worked alongside me since the Meridian Project's second year and who had agreed to come tonight because I'd asked her to and because she had, in her words, a professional interest in watching this particular social experiment unfold. "This is Priya," I said. "She runs the research division of our organization." My father shook her hand with the particular focus of someone trying to place a name. Sandra appeared from somewhere nearby, her expression doing the thing it always did, arranging itself into a pleasant shape that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Yvonne," she said. "What a surprise. We didn't know if you'd actually come." "You sent an invitation," I said pleasantly. Colt was across the room with Lindsay, his fiancée, now his wife. He looked over and gave me a nod that could have meant anything. I moved through the room with Priya, talking to people I didn't know and a few I did. A city alderman who had worked with our organisation on a transit-adjacent housing project stopped me near the bar and asked about our expansion timeline. A developer I recognised from a panel I'd moderated asked if we were still accepting applications for our technical assistance programme. I answered both, aware that the conversations were audible to the people nearby. Sandra passed us twice. The second time, she stopped. "What exactly is it that you do, Yvonne?" she asked with the particular tone of someone who has decided the answer will be small. "Your father mentioned something about housing." "We advise on how philanthropic and private capital moves into underinvested communities," I said. "We currently manage about $60 million in active project capital across the region." She blinked. $60 million? Give or take, it fluctuates by quarter. She laughed, the wrong kind of laugh, the uncertain kind. "I had no idea you were into finance." "I'm not into finance," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm into making sure families don't lose their homes because of decisions made in rooms like this one by people who never have to live with the consequences." She didn't respond. She found somewhere else to be. My father found me an hour later near the same windows where I had stood 3 years ago watching the lake. He held a glass of scotch and wore the expression of a man who had spent the evening recalibrating. "People keep asking me about your work," he said. "That happens at events like this," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know about the scope of it. You didn't ask. You didn't tell me." I turned to look at him directly. He was right, technically. I hadn't told him. "Would you have listened?" I asked. "Or would you have said I should be more realistic, that I was overextending myself, that Colt had a contact who could probably find me something more stable?" His jaw moved. He didn't answer. "I stopped telling you things," I said, "because the feedback I got was always some version of the same thing, that I was thinking too big, or in the wrong direction, or that I didn't understand how the world actually worked." I looked back at the lake. I understood how the world worked just fine. I just didn't agree with the version of it you were selling. "Yvonne!" His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. I had expected to be angry, standing here, but what I felt instead was something flatter and more final. "I'm just telling you the truth, since it seems like this is the first time in about 20 years that you're actually interested in hearing it." He stood there for a long moment. Then, softly, "I owe you an apology." "Probably," I said, "but I'm not sure I need it anymore." Nina Calloway appeared at my elbow then, as if on cue. She was attending the dinner as a guest of the alderman and had arrived late. She looked between my father and me with the expression of someone who had walked in on something and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. Richard, she said to my father, which surprised me. Apparently they knew each other, or at least knew of each other, the way people in overlapping Chicago social circles often did. I hope you know what your daughter built. She said it simply, without drama, because the rest of us certainly do. My father looked at me. Really looked, possibly for the first time in years. I'm beginning to, he said. Nina moved away to find the alderman. My father stood for another moment, then excused himself with the slightly bewildered air of a man who had attended a party he thought he understood and found it to be something else entirely. I turned back to the window. The lake was dark and flat, the same as it had been 3 years ago. The room behind me was the same room, the brass fixtures, the white jackets, the quiet noise of people who had spent their lives in rooms like this one. I was the thing that was different. Priya found me a few minutes later with 2 glasses of sparkling water and the expression she wore when she was trying not to say something. Say it, I said. He looks smaller than I expected, she said. He always has been, I said. I just couldn't see it from where I was standing. We clinked glasses. Colt found me near the coat check at the end of the night. He looked like he had been working up to something for a while. The alderman mentioned your name 3 times at dinner, he said. He's a good partner on the transit project, I said. Nina Calloway told Dad you were going to be one of the most important figures in Midwestern urban development in the next decade. I put on my coat. She's generous. Yvonne. He stopped. Started again. I should have. At the engagement party, when she tried to talk to you and I. He stopped again. I knew who she was. I knew she was looking for you specifically, and I redirected her, I said. He didn't deny it. I thought, he shook his head. I don't know what I thought. That it would make Dad happy, that it was just how things worked in our family. It was how things worked in our family, I agreed. I just decided to stop working that way. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen from him in a long time. Not guilt exactly. Something more like recognition, like he was seeing me, maybe for the first time, as an actual separate person with an actual separate life that had been happening without his knowledge or participation. Are you doing okay? He asked. It came out awkward, like a phrase in a language he didn't speak fluently. Better than okay, I said, for a long time now. I said goodnight and walked out into the November air. The city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of the particular kind of noise that means people are going somewhere. I had always loved that noise. It had meant freedom to me since I was 18 years old, with a partial scholarship and a loan package and a weekend shift at a copy shop. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute before Priya came out behind me. Food? She said. Absolutely, I said. We walked. The Whitmore Club's entrance disappeared behind us, its brass fixtures and white jackets in careful arrangements. It would go on being exactly what it was. My father would go on being mostly who he was. Colt might surprise me. He might not. None of it had the weight it used to have. I had spent years learning to carry what my family had put down, learning that the space you take up in the world is not assigned to you by the people who were supposed to love you first. It is built, slowly, out of the decisions you make at 2 a.m., when no one is watching, out of the errors you own and the corrections you issue and the calls you make on Saturday mornings to city planners in Milwaukee, out of the work that is real and the impact that is documented and the quiet accumulation of being someone who does what she says she will do. My name was on a Forbes profile. My methodology was in 3 city planning frameworks. My phone had 14 unread messages from people who needed something I could help with. None of that was for my father. It was never for my father. It was for the 9-year-old girl who used to go to the Art Institute on Tuesday afternoons with her mother and look at things that were made carefully and with love and understand, in whatever way a 9-year-old understands anything. That careful, loving work was the most real thing in the world. I had kept my promise to her. That was enough. That had always been enough. I was only now, finally, letting myself believe it. I used to think the hardest thing about being overlooked was the loneliness of it, The way a room could be full of people who shared your last name, and you could still feel like you were standing behind glass watching a life that was never quite offered to you. What I know now, and what took me an embarrassingly long time to understand, is that being overlooked is only unbearable if you need the people overlooking you to eventually see you. The moment I stopped needing that, everything changed. Not because they changed, because I did. My stepmother Sandra didn't say anything at my brother's party that she hadn't been communicating in 100 quieter ways for 20 years. The difference was that night in that room, with Nina Calloway standing 10 feet away trying to have a professional conversation with me, I finally understood what the pattern had actually cost me. Not in terms of feelings, I had made a kind of peace with the feelings a long time ago, but in real, concrete, measurable terms. Years of energy spent managing a relationship that was never going to give back what I put in. Years of showing up to things I wasn't really invited to. Years of making myself smaller in rooms where being smaller didn't actually protect me from anything. The cause of every consequence in this story is simple, even if it took me years to see it clearly. My father chose comfort over honesty for decades. He chose to let Sandra define the emotional architecture of our household, because challenging her cost him something and letting her run things cost him nothing, or so he believed. He chose to make Colt the story of his success and make me the story of his first marriage, which was also the story of his grief, which was also the story he found easiest to close the door on. None of those were malicious decisions. They were cowardly ones, and cowardice compounds. Every small choice to look away made the next one easier until he genuinely didn't know who I had become, because he had spent 20 years deciding not to find out. What I chose in response was not revenge. I want to be honest about that, because I think the word gets applied too easily to stories like mine. I did not build what I built to humiliate my father at a party. I built it because the work was real and the need was real, and I had something to offer that the world actually needed. The fact that it eventually walked back into that Whitmore Club ballroom and sat down at the table my father had spent his life cultivating, that was consequence, not plan. That was what happens when someone spends 12 years doing honest, rigorous, meaningful work and refusing to stop. Priya asked me once, during the second year of the Meridian project when things were genuinely hard, why I kept going. I told her I kept going because I had made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would not become someone who accepted the story other people told about me. That is the only philosophy I have ever needed. Not a system, not a framework, just that one refusal. The intelligence you build from being invisible, from having to check your own work twice because no one else will, from learning to read a room because you were never handed a seat at the table. That is not a consolation prize. That is an education. Sandra thought she was diminishing me the night of Colt's party. What she was actually doing without knowing it was confirming that I was still in the right room. I walked out of the Whitmore Club that November night, and I did not look back at the door. Priya and I found a diner on Michigan Avenue that was still open, and we ate eggs and talked about the Milwaukee expansion until midnight. That was the night, that was the whole of it, and it was a night.